Welcome to the Royal Inca Tunic, a conversation with R.L. Shep Memorial Book Award winner, Andrew James Hamilton. I'm Ashley Okino, Executive Director of the Textile Society of America, and TSA is a nonprofit organization that proudly provides an international forum for the exchange and dissemination of textile knowledge. This work is at the heart of our mission to build a global community and audience that celebrates textiles from an artistic, cultural, economic, historic, political, social, scientific, and technical perspectives. If this work matters to you, and if you aren't already a member, we'd love to have you join us. Please visit our website, textilesocietyofamerica.org, to learn more. And we're honored to bring you this inspiring program thanks to generous supporters like you. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you. And just a couple housekeeping reminders before I introduce our program. Please use the Q&A for questions, the chat box for greeting others, and later we'll provide a survey for commentaries and ways that we can improve. If you prefer not to see chat notifications, you can click on the chat button to toggle them on or off. And live captions make TSA programs accessible to a wider audience. If you prefer not to view captions, you can turn them off as well. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Vandana Bhandari, Textile Society of America's Director of Awards and Scholarships, who will say a few words about the R.L. Shep Memorial Book Award.
Thank you, Ashley, and welcome once again to everyone who's attending this talk. I don't know whether to say good morning or good evening because it's 9:32 p.m. my time in India, from where I am joining you from. But a very good morning to the rest of you, and I hope you have your coffees ready for this wonderful conversation. The R.L. Shep Award is given annually to a publication which is judged to be the best book in the field of global cultural heritage textile studies. And the cash award consists of a cash prize, which is funded by an endowment established by Mr. R.L. Shep in the year 2000. The purpose of this award is really to encourage the study and understanding of textile traditions by recognizing and rewarding exceptional scholarship that focuses on textiles through the lens of cultural practices and ancestral heritage. The books are reviewed, and I must say this is a very, very long and arduous process and done by a committee, which is the R.L. Shep Memorial Book Award Committee. And at this point, I'd really like to thank all of them also because they do such a wonderful job with this evaluation. And with us today are members of the 2025 committee, Dr. Florina Baker, who's the chairperson of the committee, Dr. Julia Hendon, and Dr. Kaja McGowan. And I request the committee now to say hello to everybody and hand over to Dr. Julia Hendon, who will introduce Andrew, our wonderful speaker for today and the winner of the Shep Award and the book. Thank you.
Would you like me to start, Julia, since you'll
Yes.
take?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. I'm Professor Kaja McGowan. I teach at Cornell University in the history of art and visual culture. And I'm very happy to be here today. I think this is an extraordinary book and worthy of high praise. So I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation, Andrew.
And I'm Julia Hendon. I'm a professor emerita from Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania. My specialty is the archaeology of Mesoamerica, so Mexico and Central America. But in my teaching career, I've taught about the past history of the Americas, including South America. So reading Andrew's book was a real delight. It's a wonderful book, and I urge everybody to see if you can get a copy and read it for yourselves. Our guest today is Andrew James Hamilton, author of The Royal Inca Tunic, a biography of an Andean masterpiece, published by Princeton University Press in 2024. Andrew is the Curator of Arts of the Americas at the Art Institute of Chicago, where he oversees the collection of ancient through contemporary indigenous American art alongside colonial Latin American art. As a scholar of indigenous art and architecture of the Americas, his research focuses on analyzing objects, how they were made, used, and ultimately discarded to understand their cultural meanings and the reasons for their creation. So welcome, Andrew, and I think we're all looking forward to your talk very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just want to start by thanking the Textile Society of America. It's really hard to express how much it means to have won the R.L. Shep Memorial Book Award. Many of the approaches that I take in my research were first inspired by Shep's publications and the attention to making that they encourage. I spent more than a decade on this project, and I'm so grateful for the recognition that this award brings. Certain objects can tell 1,000 stories. Visited and revisited, they divulge chapters of their lives, detail by minute detail. An intricate textile in the collection of the Dumbarton Oaks Research Library and Museum is one such object. The rectangular tapestry woven garment is so much associated with the place that specialists simply refer to it as the Dumbarton Oaks tunic. The textile can be stylistically identified as a shirt from the Inca Empire, where it would have been called an unku, the general word for a man's tunic in Quechua. The Incas rose to power around 1400, and from their capital of Cusco, in what's now Peru, they assembled the largest indigenous empire in the Americas, which they called Tawantinsuyu. It stretched from the border of Colombia and Ecuador to central Chile and Argentina. However, in 1531, their empire was invaded by Spanish forces led by Francisco Pizarro, and was eventually conquered in 1572. Although very little is concretely known about the 500-year-old weaving, it has become the most famous work of Andean art in the world. So much so that its image is now emblazoned on scarves, socks, and cell phone cases, and even face masks. The tunic was first acquired by the American diplomat, philanthropist, and founder of Dumbarton Oaks, Robert Woods Bliss, sometime before 1954. The exact date he acquired it has never been known. In the decade after it appeared in the Bliss collection, it was recognized that it matches tunics drawn by an indigenous author and illustrator, Felipe Wamampoma de Ayala, in a manuscript that he created from around 1600. In the late 1970s, anthropologist John Rowe observed that although Wamampoma drew many Inca elites wearing garments with various quantities of these motifs, called tacapus, he only showed Inca rulers wearing tunics completely covered by them. This evidence suggests that the Dumbarton Oaks tunic is a royal vestment. It is the only royal Inca object of any media that survives anywhere in the world.
Andrew, could there's been a request, could you just speak up a little bit louder if possible, please? Thank you.
But because scholars have had so little information about the unku, we don't know where it was archaeologically found, or even if it's an archaeological artifact. Somewhat counterintuitively, the singular object has come to be addressed as an example of a type. This would be unthinkable for a royal European artifact, for which research into lineages, successions, and inheritances would almost certainly dominate scholarship. In stunning contrast, the question of whom the tunic was made for has never been the focus of sustained research. Instead, the tunic's immense fame has accrued through research interpreting its tacapus as a long-lost lithic writing system, despite the fact that in the colonial period, both Spanish and indigenous authors repeatedly stated that the Incas never developed writing and never indicated that tacapus functioned in this way. Nonetheless, in 1970, the fantastical proposition landed the tunic in the New York Times and Time magazine, which even published an imaginative translation of part of the cloth. Ever since, arguments for or against the tacapus' capacity for language have dominated scholarship on the object. I see two broad issues of these lines of inquiry that I seek to address in my work. First, the desire to portray the unku as a glyphic text reveals an underlying prejudice. Whether overtly or implicitly. It seeks to mold Inca culture to meet Eurocentric expectations for quote-unquote high civilizations, advancing the premise that the Incas must have had writing, in spite of all evidence to the contrary, because they otherwise would have been unable to administer such a large empire. These ethnic biases are not so far from ancient alien conspiracy theories, like those popularized by Eric Vandana and perpetuated by the History Channel. My research seeks to create space for and give shape to the people behind the tunic, those who made it, wore it, and cared for it. And through what can be reconstructed of their experiences with the object, I attempt to understand its significance today. The second issue is that previous studies of the garment have largely been conducted from photographs. It's as if the Takapus were simply thought to be words on a page, where the paper itself could be ignored. I don't believe that the tunic is a text, but it is an object whose materiality we must learn to read. I've spent a decade studying this object thread by thread, and you have to understand how incredibly fine it is. The illustrious garment has more wefts per inch than there were pixels in the screen of the 9th generation iPad released in 2021. As I will show, these minute fibers hide the secrets of its life history. As scholars, we're often people of words. Learning to read an object engages very different parts of the brain. In texts, everything is literally all spelled out. But sometimes we might put too much faith in historical sources, and that can generate confusion. I mentioned that scholars have long recognized that the tunic likely belonged to an Inca ruler called a Sapa Inca, because of illustrations in Felipe Wamampoma de Ayala's manuscript. But while the manuscript has deepened our understanding of the object, it's also undermined it. You'll notice that Wamampoma drew the Takapus repeating in diagonal lines, because this is not a feature of the Dumbarton's tunic. Some scholars suspected that the tunic might not be from the Inca period at all, but rather might date to after the Spanish invasion in 1531. Officially, Dumbarton Oaks dates the object from 1450 to 1540, essentially hedging bets. Part of the reason Wamampoma's manuscript so significantly shaped understandings of the tunic is that it became widely available through a facsimile published in 1936, well before Bliss acquired the garment. However, two other bewilderingly interlinked manuscripts have more recently come to light that offer additional information. Wamampoma didn't create his chronicle out of the blue. He was previously employed as an illustrator by a Mercedarian friar named Martin de Murua. Before 1590, Wamampoma and another of other illustrators helped Murua create a manuscript that reappeared in 1879, but was inaccessible until 1996, when it was located in the private collection of John Galvin in Ireland. In the earlier Galvin Murua, images of this style of royal vestment are much closer to how the Dumbarton Oaks tunic actually looks. The renderings are less schematic and more naturalistic, and the Takapus are not organized in diagonal lines. So had it been the other way around, had the Galvin Murua been accessible first, and Wamapoma's manuscript had been lost, there never would have been reason to doubt that the Dumbarton Oaks tunic is an authentic royal Inca vestment. The second relevant manuscript was started after Wamampoma's and remains unfinished. Wamampoma and Martin de Murua had a falling out. Wamampoma went off and created his own text, while Murua decided to create a final, expanded version of his. The chronicle only includes one illustration of this royal tunic, created around 1615, and it brings into focus an issue that shaped all three manuscripts. Notice the strong red grid between the Takapus. This is a feature of many colonial-era Inca tunics, like this one. In the Dumbarton Oaks tunic, instead of a grid, each Takapu is individually framed, a more labor-intensive design. What this shows is that as the colonial period illustrators became more and more distanced from the heyday of the Inca Empire. The images they produced were gradually more influenced by the colonial styles of garments that they were seeing around them. But the consequence of these diagonal lines in theories of glyphic writing is that many scholars came to insist that the composition of the Dumbarton's tunic was simply random. John Rowe concluded that the Jacapus give the general impression of a random distribution. Elena Phipps stated that many scholars have tried to map and interpret the sequence of patterns of Jacapu motifs as they occur within the tunic. All concur that it's not possible to detect a logical, arithmetical, or otherwise pattern sequence. And Rebecca Stone agreed. I myself spent time within the trenches obsessively diagramming the welter of the royal tunic's detailed shapes and magnificent colors. None of us found the key to the visual order. It seems rather unproductive to search this composition for messages that it patently does not send. Unable to explain the tunic's organization, scholars insisted that there was no organization. The problem is that the tunic has always been considered as it is now exhibited and as it was originally worn. Perhaps the assumption has been that the sovereign's view and views of the sovereign would have taken precedence over the maker's perspective. However, if we examine how the textile was woven, a different understanding emerges. The tunic was actually created sideways as a single panel of cloth, woven in rows from bottom to top, that was later folded in half and seamed up the sides. But which edge of the cloth did the weaver start from? This question has been the single greatest obstacle to understanding the elusive garment. We have to know where the maker began in order to know which direction they worked in, so that we can parse their logic. Scholars have always thought that the tunic was woven in this orientation. This particular Jakapu and the ones around it appear somewhat compressed, as if the weaver ran out of space as they were finishing. But if we look closely, notice that its frame disappears 2/3 of the way through the motif. It doesn't make sense that the weaver would perfectly weave the frames of over 300 Jakapus and then forget to continue making one at the very end, the last row. Structural evidence is more conclusive than formal qualities. And in the case of the tunic, it reveals that the cloth was actually woven in the opposite direction. The neck opening was woven into the cloth through something called a scaffold. Separate sets of warps wrapped around a horizontal cord. As the weaver worked up to the underside of the scaffold, it would have been increasingly difficult to get the needle through. Eventually, the weaver began weaving on top of the scaffold. After the tunic was complete, the scaffold could be pulled out. Like a knitter casting off, the maker had to thread each of the warp loops through the next ones. But look, those on the bottom side were worked through 2 neighboring loops, while those on the top are only worked through 1. The bottom loops were slightly longer because of the width of the needle still had to pass through the threads. These kinds of minute details demonstrate why it's critical to understand how artists manipulated their tools, technologies, and materials. So if we re-examine this Takapu, it's much more likely that the weaver forgot the frame as they were starting the textile. They realized their mistake 1/3 of the way through and amended the pattern. Furthermore, if we look to the other side of the textile, we can see a Takapu in the final row that was artfully extended in the direction of weaving to fill extra space on the loom as the textile was completed. So far, I've been using they as a gender-neutral singular pronoun because the identity of the maker has never been really considered, a fate of many museum objects from outside of Europe and the United States. But these and other small differences between the 2 sides of the cloth actually suggest that there were 2 weavers with different skill levels who collaborated to create the royal tunic. This makes sense because of the long, low shape of the loom. Rather than a random composition, these 2 makers added Jakapus to the tunic according to a clear method. There are around 25 motifs, depending on how you count color variations. Instead of just placing all 25 into the first row, the weavers agreed upon a batch of 13. It was a logical decision. It would have been very slow to weave 25 unique takapus all at once at the very beginning. Instead, they wove multiple iterations of half of them. 8 motifs were woven by both weavers. After they completed the first row, they incorporated a second batch of 12 takapus. Only 6 from the first row were repeated in the second. This makes the first and second rows the most statistically distinct in the whole textile. While in the first row, the 2 weavers largely wove the same motifs in tandem. In the second row, there were only 3 takapus that they both created. It's as if in the first row, they wove the ones that they could mutually agree upon, and then they filled out the corpus by picking their own individual favorites. After the first 2 rows, no new takapus were added. I think this is clear evidence of how the designs were transmitted to weavers. There were no Inca pattern books or fashion plates. It's most likely that the weavers were copying the motifs off of a recently finished tunic. After the first 2 rows, they could relinquish the template because all the knowledge needed to complete the textile was already embedded in the object. I think this also suggests where the tunic was being woven and who the weavers were. As John Rowe once enumerated, 3 groups of weavers supplied the Sapa Inca's wardrobe. The first were men named Kumbikamayoks. The second were women called Akyas and Mamakonas, who were cloistered in Akyawasis. The third group were wives of regional lords. Scholars have considered these weavers in social and economic terms, but have not explored what it would have entailed for them as artists to create works like the royal tunic. In both chronicles and modern scholarship, Kumbikamayoks have often been the most vaunted. In part, this is because their name contained kumbi, which was the Inca's term for the very finest grade of cloth. But I suspect Kumbikamayoks have also been recognized because they were men. However, Kumbikamayoks seemingly wove in isolation, often in distant parts of the empire. It's unclear how a Kumbikamayok would have first acquired an article of the emperor's personal wardrobe in order to copy it. Similarly, it's not well understood how Inca administrators would have solicited or retrieved new garments from them, or have supplied them with the finest fibers to weave with, while also ensuring that they didn't steal any. The wives of regional lords raised similar questions. I think both these sets of weavers likely wove generic styles of takapu garments for the emperor, as well as takapu garments that he could gift to nobles and conquered lords. It's much more likely that the royal Inca tunic was woven by the cloistered women weavers. Unfortunately, in scholarship, one readily finds Inca weaving discussed as something with which housewives filled their free time. Not only does this mischaracterize their cloth production, one of the highest priorities of the Inca state, as a leisure activity, but it also imports a modern concept of a wife's role that's not applicable here. Akyas were taken from their communities around the age of 8 and brought to government-run Akyawasis, where they were taught skills like food preparation, brewing, spinning, and weaving by the older Mamakonas. During state rituals, when the Sapa Inca's court passed through a settlement, Akyas prepared their food and drink. This has caused hospitality to seem like one of their essential responsibilities. But what I think it actually created was access. A moment when the emperor's administrators could seed Akyawasis with new garments that they wanted copied and could have claimed finished ones. Between royal visits, the precious weavings could safely accumulate because the compound functioned as both a fortress and a prison. Akyas were forced to remain virgins. This called Spaniards to describe them as nuns and has led scholarship examining these forced sexual behaviors in a patriarchal system. Fundamentally, though, I think that the Inca state was after the impact of celibacy on their work. Akyas were the only female weavers in the empire, with years of formal training, good eyesight, and no arthritis, who could weave without the responsibilities and interruptions of child rearing. But as Akyas aged, they wouldn't all have remained wunderkinds. Because Akyas lived entirely off the state's resources, the state needed a way to offload ones who were underperforming. Akyas could be given away as wives, and I think this is how the wives of local lords first learned to create royal garments. Akyas could also be made as human sacrifices in a ceremony called the Kapakocha. Akyas who remained in the Akyawasi eventually became mamakonas, but the process through which this occurred has not been well understood. I think the Dumbarton Oaks tunic speaks directly to this issue. As I showed, there's a significant disparity between the garment's two sides. The weaver seated on the left was consistent and confident. She carefully considered decisions and was good at solving problems. It seems like this might have been the work of a mamakona. In contrast, the weaver on the right seems more likely to be a less experienced Akya. As we saw in the first row, she sometimes made significant mistakes. In another instance, she started weaving a spiral with the wrong color, a dark blue, and then switched to green. She regularly attempted variations, for example, switching the colors within a motif. Sometimes these innovations were successful and transformed the motif throughout the rest of the textile. In other cases, this willingness to experiment resulted in problems that had to be fixed. She made her most egregious error in the second to last row, when she started to create 8 takapus, about 5 millimeters too short. By the time she or her partner caught the error, she could only augment the height of the outer 2. The mistake throws off the whole grid, the one thing that was supposed to be uniform. In these passages, the tunic manifests an exciting dynamic that has rarely been identified in Inca art. Learning. It is in this sense that I refer to the tunic as a masterpiece. The word is now used offhandedly, but originally, it was a work of art that was considered a demonstration of mastery. The Dumbarton Oaks tunic was clearly a test of the right-hand weaver's skill. Was she an Akya, working to become a mamakona? Ultimately, there is good reason to suspect that the makers of this seminal work of Andean art were women. Now, in trying to determine the meaning of the takapu's designs, scholars have always wanted to find a pattern that explains the importance of all the takapus simultaneously and equally. But the takapus were not created equally. The Akya and Mamakona created this particular design much more frequently, a total of 33 times, and it was one of the most laborious to weave. It's actually the motif that spawned the glyphic language theories, because it pictorially represents another very common style of Inca unku, which scholars called a checkerboard tunic. However, my previous work has examined how scale, in particularly reduced scaled relationships, were a recurring form of signification in Inca art. This is actually the only Inca object I know that features reduced scale checkerboard tunic motifs. Remarkably, the historical significance of checkerboard tunics was recorded by Francisco de Jerez. He appears to have seen these tunics firsthand on November 16, 1532, when Emperor Atahualpa and his armies first met Francisco Pizarro. As the Inca soldiers approached the plaza carrying the emperor on a litter, the path in front of him was groomed by a squadron of soldiers. Jerez described their tunics precisely as we do today, as a checkerboard. These are the only Inca tunics yet discovered that so directly fit this description, and they have been found in sufficient numbers to have conceivably been a military uniform. Jerez stated that these soldiers were armed with slings, the reason the Spanish decided to attack, suggesting that they were an elite, professionally trained royal guard. Jerez's description indicates that in formal processions, potentially wherever the Inca tunic appeared in public, he would have been preceded by soldiers wearing checkerboard tunics. Thus, the reduced scaled object would always have been framed by its referent object. Certainly, this was anticipated by the state weavers who produced both styles. The royal tunic's composition is not a basic repetition or sequence, but nor do I think that it is random as scholars have often resolved. the tukapus are arranged in a simple but profoundly symbolic way. The military tunics saturate the composition. Tukapu garments were worn by Inca nobles and conquered elites throughout the empire, and this juxtaposition leaves no significant gaps within the motifs that escape military control. The reduced-scaled military tunics weave together the composition of the emperor's tunic, just as his actual armies united his empire. This would have made a powerful sartorial statement that could be interpreted in two ways. To loyal subjects, this was a reassurance of military protection. But to those contemplating dissension, the emperor's vestment would have been a sobering warning that Inca armies, the most powerful military on the continent, were never far away. This reading of the Unku's composition suggests that it was not just a royal Inca tunic, but an imperial Inca tunic. But the way that the Akya and the Mamakona created the reduced-scaled military tunics offers another clue about the imperial vestment. Each features a zigzag line across its bottom edge. Indeed, on these and actual checkerboard tunics, the lower row of blocks is elongated to make room for this embellishment, as we can see in this detail of a checkerboard tunic at the Met. The zigzag line was the finishing touch of all Inca state tunics. The weavers of the Dumbartonooks tunic similarly anticipated a zigzag line would be embroidered, because they added a dark blue band for it at the bottom of the garment. However, there is no embroidery. Scholarship has been so preoccupied with tukapus that it has largely overlooked the only part of the imperial tunic not covered by them. Close examination of this band reveals 62 holes from right to left across one side. They are visible to the naked eye because of small breaks in the wefts. Beyond this, there are finer holes extending to the other side seam. Although less visible, they can be revealed by shining a light through the fabric. Someone started to embroider the multicolor zigzag line, working with multiple needles. They carried all the colors halfway across the garment, but only 2 colors ever reached the other side. I found remnants of red and tan thread embedded in the opposite seam. After months or years of labor on this extraordinary tunic, work abruptly stopped when it was only hours away from completion. The embroidery on this side of the tunic was left unfinished. The embroidery on the other side was never even begun. Rather than finish it, someone later systematically removed the incomplete embroidery. The Dumbartonooks tunic is, in fact, an unfinished masterpiece. This minute detail reveals so much about the object's life. It can be contextualized by Pedro Pizarro's eyewitness description of how Sapa Incas wore clothes. Pizarro visited Atahualpa while he was imprisoned by the Spanish. Atahualpa was dining, and much to Pizarro's surprise, when a drop of food fell on the emperor's tunic, his female attendants whisked him into the other room to change his soiled clothing. Inca emperors supposedly changed garments many times each day, and may never have worn the same garment twice. This episode suggests how unlikely it is that a Sapa Inca would ever have worn a conspicuously unfinished vestment. Moreover, the bodies of Sapa Incas were considered sacred. Anything they touched, down to the bones in their food, was collected, stockpiled, and ritually burned at the end of each year. At the end of each emperor's life, all their long-term possessions were burned in a funerary rite called the Purakaia. This goes a long way towards explaining why the Dumbartonooks tunic is the only surviving royal Inca artifact anywhere in the world. All the others like it would have been intentionally burned. The fact that it is unfinished likely reveals why it survived. There's only really one moment in Inca history when I think it would make sense that an imperial vestment of this stature would remain unfinished: the Spanish invasion. after Atahualpa was imprisoned and eventually executed in July of 1533. There was no clear successor until the puppet emperor Manco Inca was coronated 6 months later. In this window of time, the beginning of the conquest of the Inca Empire, I believe the nearly complete Dumbarton's tunic was repurposed. There are a handful of people in the colonial period who could have had the standing to first acquire the tunic from an Akiawasi. Other members of the Inca royal family, such as Atahualpa's brothers, Manco Inca or Payu Inca, or perhaps powerful generals commanding the Inca army. But because Spaniards were simultaneously stealing things from the royal storehouses, it could make sense that whoever acquired the imperial tunic might have chosen to keep it unfinished in order to show it wasn't stolen off the back of a dead emperor. What is clear is that by 1535, Manco Inca, in a desperate attempt to drive the Spanish out of Cusco, laid siege to his own capital. By this point, the Akiawasi was derelict, and the Dumbarton's tunic would have been recognized as an important heirloom, a rare vestment that could no longer be recreated. The material qualities of the tunic suggest how the fibers slowly began to age. I mentioned earlier that one of the signs that the Dumbarton's tunic was created during the Inca period is the laboriously woven borders around the tacapus instead of a single red grid. For the weavers to achieve this, each tacapu had to have a preferred border color, as well as an alternate. So the two tacapus with the same color border would never be next to each other. But looking at the tunic now, the weaver's efforts to create chromatic contrasts are not always apparent. Large swaths of contiguous tacapus have very similar tan or yellowish borders. These color adjacencies undermine the grid that the weavers worked so hard to structure. Such issues are also apparent within tacapus. Some seem irregular, lopsided, or imbalanced due to faint tan designs that the weavers nonetheless toiled to create. Scholars have usually considered the colors of the Dumbarton's tunic to be exceedingly bright. Indeed, when it was exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2004, the catalog stated that it was in an excellent state of color preservation. The vibrant red is likely derived from a dye made by the bodies of cochineal insects. The deep blue, which defines the darkest end of the tunic's color spectrum, was almost certainly created with indigo. But the potency of these colors, combined with the quantity of other colors, have masked the fact that all the tunic's colors are not equally well preserved. As the tunic has aged over the past 5 centuries, it has suffered massive dye fading. The question of what the faded tan originally was can be determined by using the rules that the weavers carefully observed elsewhere in the cloth. The process is sort of like solving for a variable in a mathematical equation. The faded tan equals the color that it was never placed next to. That color is dark blue. It's likely that 2 sources of dark blue were used in the tunic. One was permanent, the other faded. The weavers distinguished between them and used them for different compositional elements. Even so, the 2 colors were close enough, perhaps nearly identical, that the weavers could confuse them. Once, in the dark blue band, the weaver on the right accidentally used the wrong color of blue, the fugitive one. She wove a few rows before realizing her mistake. 500 years later, they are faded tan threads within a field of blue. Here, the other weaver was using the fugitive blue, ran out of thread, and then accidentally rethreaded her needle with the permanent blue. Again, it took her a number of rows to see the difference. Once she realized her mistake, she switched her thread to the correct fugitive blue. Now, the blue threads stand out against a faded tan background. These are mistakes that the weavers would not have made unless the 2 colors were originally very close. Blue dye fading clearly occurred in other Inca state textiles. An example of another type of Inca uniform in the Wereld Museum in Rotterdam exhibits extensive dye fading of a dark blue that reverted to tan. And the Museo Nacional in Lima conserves an example that has completely faded. The weavers of the Dumbarton's tunic almost certainly knew that the dye would fade. But of course, the illustrious imperial vestment was only meant to have been worn once, after which it would have been burned. Its dyes were never intended to survive this long. Recoloring the tunic, takapu by takapu, shows how significantly this missing color would have changed its appearance. The grid underlying the motifs, so essential to the composition of the takapus themselves, becomes much more evident. Its strong golden cast is removed, and the colors become more balanced. This is likely what the weavers originally saw 500 years ago, and what we can now see for the first time. And there's the rub. 50 years of attempts to read the takapus of the Dumbarton's tunic all interpreted the motifs based on how they appear in the present. Researchers studied the designs, trying to spot recognizable things in the shapes and colors, in order to construe takapus as pictograms. It should now be clear that these ventures were not seeing the renowned garment in its original form. The fugitive blue reveals that the whole premise of takapu writing was based on an incomplete understanding of what the designs were, even in a basic visual way. The missing color offers a chance to reset scholarship on the Dumbarton's tunic. As I mentioned, the other long unanswered question related to the vestment's age is whether it's an archaeological artifact that survived the centuries buried in the ground, or is a historical object passed down from generation to generation. Other material qualities of the tunic speak to this issue. Although the unfinished umku would not have been worn by an emperor during the Inca period, it has been worn and worn out. The tunic's history of use has never really been studied or articulated, but it's part of what confirms that the garment was not a burial offering unearthed from a grave in recent times, like the vast majority of Andean textiles in museums today. For its threads to have accrued their significant wear, it could not have been resting silently, passively waiting out the centuries, only to have suddenly reappeared within the last. At some point, perhaps fairly early in the tunic's life, a force was applied to the supremely fine fabric, and the neck opening ripped, here highlighted in red. On one side, the tear measures 5.5 centimeters, and on the other, the damage was over twice as long, some 12 centimeters in total. It seems likely that the tunic was being worn when this trauma occurred. In the Inca period, such damage would clearly have caused the vestment to be terminated. But that's not what happened. After it was torn, someone diligently tried to repair it. They used at least 5 different colors of thread to try and match the cloth, but the threads were far too heavy. This was not the handwork of an imperially trained Inca weaver. Perhaps by the time the Dumbarton's tunic was mended, the generation of weavers who lived through the Spanish invasion had already passed on. It seems likely that the mutilated vestment would only have been worn like this in the colonial period, if there were no other option. These bungled repairs extended the life of a precious heirloom. As time went on, the garment continued aging and weakening, but the newer, thicker repair stitches were not. Unfortunately, force was again exerted on the venerated garment. The mess of repair stitches held together like knots, but 2 new tears opened on each side of the garment. This second incident was unequivocally distinct from the first, because the new tears were longer. If this had been the extent of the damage, the tunic might have had a chance of being worn again. But the greatest damage was caused by the wearer's shoulders slamming into the decrepit threads. The cloth recorded its brutal contact with the human flesh as a field of shattered warps across the top of the back. It was a mortal blow. The life of the tunic as a garment ended. Whatever happened next, the tunic does not bear a material record of it. No one tried to restore it to a wearable state after this calamity. But it seemingly was not forgotten. At some point, moths found the tunic and ate small holes into it, but the damage is very limited, as if someone was taking care of it, noticed, and moved to protect it. In the colonial period, elites who could prove their nobility could receive land and titles from the Spanish crown, and the imperial tunic, no matter how damaged, might have been indispensable in this errand. It's also worth considering that after its utility as a garment ended, its former wearer may no longer have found use for it. Someone else might have formed a new sense of its value, precipitating a transfer of ownership. Colonial chronicles describe other imperial tunics that were sold, bequeathed, and stolen. Some eventually came to be possessed by non-Incas and were transported across the Atlantic. As I discussed at the beginning of my talk, we can identify the Dumbarton's tunic as a Royal Inca vestment because of illustrations stemming from the manuscript of Martin de Merua. But how did he become so familiar with this style? In 2017, Francisco de Borja de Guinigalde published for the first time a 1615 inventory of the belongings that Martin de Merua sent to his brother Diego upon his ultimate return to Escoriaza, Spain. It's easy to locate the Galvin manuscript within the list, described as a draft of a book with some images of the Indies. But the most remarkable entry states that in another bag, made of camelid wool, there was a fine wool shirt that seems to have been a shirt of the Inca king. That is, Merua actually owned a royal Inca tunic. While it's impossible to determine whether the Dumbarton's tunic was brought by Merua to Spain in 1615, he certainly knew what such garments looked like, and this could explain the accordance between the Dumbarton's tunic and his illustrations. Unfortunately, Merua's royal tunic weathered the journey far better than the man himself. Merua reached Escoriaza in November, but by December he was dead. What befell the royal Inca tunic in his possession is not yet known. There's no indication of how long the Dumbarton's tunic waited in this dilapidated state. The next thing it materially remembers was the tickle of fine needles piercing its many wounds. Carrying filaments of human hair, they painstakingly re-threaded the wefts that had spilled loose around the many warp breaks. Whereas the colonial era repairs were outsized and clumsy, these stitches bore a precise one-to-one relationship with each damaged thread. Moreover, while the earlier stitches were created with the assumption that they would be unavoidably visible, these nearly translucent stitches aimed to be imperceptible. And while the earlier repairs were worked from both sides of the cloth, this time the needle only came and went from the outside, signaling full awareness that the garment was too fragile to be turned inside out to conduct such work on the interior. In contrast to the earlier repairs that sought to maintain the garment's wearability, these were only designed to minimize the appearance of damage while imparting a modest level of structural integrity. The repairer was under no illusion that the garment would be worn again. These feats of modern conservation were enormously accomplished. The unrecorded repairer acted with a surgeon's confidence, knowing that the life could be saved. This means that the conservation work was also probably very expensive. When dealers restored antiquities before selling them, repairs were often mediocre. They generally wanted to invest enough in the object to achieve an optimal sale, but they didn't want to cut into their profits. The tunic's conservation is of a caliber that may have only been invested after a buyer was secured, or in the case of Robert Woods Bliss, who could have paid any price, by the owner himself. Clearly meant to render the tunic exhibitable, the repairs signal yet another metamorphosis, the tunic's transformation into a work of art. It was reborn as something to again be publicly viewed and interpreted, a celebrated concentration of technical mastery and material luxury, and a visible expression of power, nobility, and wealth, all roles that As my talk has shown, the imperial tunic was already well accustomed to playing. The files at Dumbarton Oaks do not speak directly to this period of the tunic's life. As I mentioned, Dumbarton Oaks has only known that Bliss acquired the tunic before 1954, the year a woman named Elizabeth Benson began working at the National Gallery of Art. From the late 1940s, Robert Woods Bliss exhibited his collection at the newly formed museum, and when Benson arrived, the Imperial Inca tunic was already there. Benson went on to become the first director of pre-Columbian studies at Dumbarton Oaks, and Bliss's collection was transferred to the institution in 1963. Unfortunately, Robert had died the year before from lung cancer and never had the chance to see the fruits of his life's work. But although the Dumbarton Oaks tunic does not have records of the tunic's arrival in Washington, as I've uncovered, the National Gallery does. An incoming receipt, number 934, dated June 14, 1949, provides the earliest yet documentation of the imperial tunic. The extraordinary object was simply described as one tapestry. To be sure, it's a humble way to refer to what is now the most famous work of Andean art in the world. It seems possible that Bliss didn't totally know what he'd acquired and had bought it as a fixer-upper, expecting it could be improved through talented conservation. Notably, in November 1950, Grace Denny, an emeritus professor of home economics, wrote to Bliss, asking him about his textile collection. He drew attention to a Paracas mantle that he'd acquired around the same time, clearly considering it his star piece, but did not even mention the Imperial Inca tunic. Instead, he wrote, "I do not think that any one of the pieces is unique, but it would require an expert, which I do not pretend to be, to answer that question." For more than 5 decades, the Imperial Inca tunic has been the focus of fervent scholarly attention, but it has largely been studied from photographs. Without historical sources speaking directly to the object, scholars from a variety of disciplines may have assumed that we can never really know anything about its life. As a result, in spite of its immense celebrity, it's been unclear when it was made, where it was made, who made it, and whom it was made for. The unku was relegated to being an example of a type, an anonymous object without a discernible life history. But the study of an object should never start with photographs or texts about it. An object is a first-hand testimony of its maker, and art historical methods are well positioned to recover this knowledge. My close physical studies of this remarkably complex textile entirely rewrite our understanding of it. The vestment was likely made by 2 women weavers in Inakiawasi. Its designs, organized by a logic rooted in the artistic practice of its makers, seemingly enacted a sartorial statement of Inca imperial power, meaning that the opulent vestment is not just a royal tunic, but an imperial tunic. Probably being created on the eve of the Spanish invasion of the Inca Empire around 1532 for Emperor Atahualpa, it was left unfinished, potentially after he was executed. If it wasn't worn by the emperor, it wouldn't have had to have been ritually burned, offering an explanation for why it survives. It was demonstrably worn in the colonial period and torn twice. And there's the possibility that it was eventually acquired by Martin de Marua, whose manuscripts bear illustrations that closely resemble it. The damage the tunic accrued was expertly repaired, likely around the time Robert Woods Bliss acquired it, some 5 years earlier than has previously been attested. As a likely eyewitness to the horrors of colonialism and an enduring testament to indigenous sovereignty, the artistic, historic, and cultural significance of the Imperial Inca tunic cannot be overstated. Assuredly, the textile has more stories to tell those who are willing to listen. And so, it patiently waits, carefully attended by the staff at Dumbarton Oaks, for the next person to come study it. In so doing, it serves as a reminder both of the importance of art historical research and the mission and value of museums as institutions to care for and preserve objects of cultural importance beyond the lifespan of any one scholar or individual. But it's important to realize that the tunic's biography is ongoing. The object continues to attain meaning in the present. In Cusco, photographs of the tunic are frequently used to reweave its tekapu patterns as wall hangings by artists like Edgar Sulca-Leon, who refer to it as the Calendario Inca or Inca calendar because of its gridded composition. I hope that my book can bring awareness to the tunic, not simply as an image or visual concept, but as an extant object, and connect it to the important history that it represents. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. That was absolutely fascinating. And there are a few questions that came up, and I'd love to share those with you. And of course, I'd love for the Shep committee, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to share those as well. But first, let's go to the Q&A. And I don't know if you can see it as well, Andrew, but I'm happy to read them to you.
I think, yeah, I just popped it open. Great.
So the first one, I'll just read it out for the group, is were you able to identify the number of threads per inch for the warp and the weft?
Yes, that is actually established by ANRO in the 1996 catalog that Dumbarton Oaks produced. I'm not remembering exactly off the top of my head how many it is exactly. I'm sure I have it here in my notes around me, but I think it's and the other reason I forget, I won't try and quote it because the other thing I'm always constantly doing is switching the numbers between centimeters and inches, and then forgetting which one goes back and forth depending on whether I'm talking about it in Peru or talking about the US. But it is in that 1996 catalog, and it is also in my book. But it's very, very fine and much finer than any other surviving Inca textiles. Some Wari tunics from the Middle Horizon are finer, but it is the finest known Inca textile.
Thank you. It's in the book. And another question says, you mention and disprove that such textiles might have served as accounting devices over the empire. But the Inca caboose system extensively served that purpose. So why would anyone think that textiles had a different role here?
Well, so yeah, quipus are something I didn't touch on in the talk, but they are a system for recording knowledge that was used in the Inca Empire. They're made of knotted strings. So they have, they are, Incas and Andean societies generally were using fiber to solve so many questions in society and use for so many different forms of technology. But I think in some ways that kind of actually already answers the question. Like the Incas already had a really well-developed system also in fiber for notating knowledge. And a lot of great research has done things like uncover the number system used in quipus. I've published on quipus before and how the knots are made. And again, I think sort of a material and sort of approach to understanding the making of quipus will help us understand a lot more of how knowledge was embedded in them. I think very clearly the tekapu is used here in the tunic. Evidence other forms of knowledge and other kinds of symbolic importance. But I just think it's different from something like a writing system. And as I sort of get into in the book, you can tell that the choices that the weavers are making as they decide what tekapu to place next into the garment are largely driven by not wanting to have repetition of patterns next to each other or color adjacencies. And you can also see that like over the course of the textile, the weavers fully change some of the details within each tekapu based on small decisions. Like, for instance, if they put on an extra border around the outside of the tunic, or outside of each tekapu, which they sometimes do to avoid color repetitions in the borders, they'll actually omit smaller details from inside the design because there's no longer enough space to incorporate them within. So what that sort of just shows is that the weavers had like a lot of autonomy for transforming the designs as they worked, which isn't a sort of quality that we would expect if they were actually glyphs and meaning really codified meanings, that you wouldn't expect that each individual weaver would have the autonomy to sort of transform them on the fly, like the takapus in the tunic suggest. But yeah, but quipus are a really fascinating study, and there's some really great graduate students and scholars at Harvard who are advancing new research on them and have some new great websites for quipus that they put out there. So I encourage you to look, especially Manny Medrano is who I'm thinking of, and encourage you to look up their work.
Great, that's fantastic. And the next question says, I was searching your book for the picture of the tunic with the retouched fugitive blue. Is there a picture in the book?
Yes, there is a picture in the book of the retouched blue. There's lots of, there's a one illustration too, where I take each takapu one by one and sort of show what the takapus recolored would look like throughout the book, and throughout the tunic. And what was really interesting is that I took the photograph on my iPad with the sort of digital pen and worked to recolor every single instance of it. And of course, there's hundreds of instances of this use of the faded blue throughout. And in doing it, there was never a question as to what color it was, like what color needed, what element needed recoloring. And I kind of, as I was doing it, expected sooner or later I'm going to get into a bind and not know, was this the tan or was this the blue that faded, et cetera. And what was just so remarkable about it was just so cut and dry. It was just very clear where it was. And what was interesting was some of the designs that the sort of less experienced weaver seemed to create sort of irregularities within, actually had a lot to do with her using the wrong blue and then it fading and making it look like it was another sort of colorway or whatever of the design, when in fact it was just the wrong blue and fading. So that was also a sort of interesting aspect of that.
It's incredibly interesting, I think. There's two more, just a few more questions here, and then we'll turn it over. Could you just quickly share again the time period for the more expert restoration?
So I think that the human hair restorations probably took place in either the mid to late 40s or after 1949, when it arrived at the National Gallery of Art. I really welcome anyone's input on this, places to look, places to, potentially conservators or restorers that might have been working in the DC area. What I've been doing is going through Bliss's letters to other conservators that I know who worked for him and seeing what they mention in their letters at the time. So for instance, there are conservators working at the Harvard Peabody Museum, and they talk about restoring that Paracas mantle during the exact same time period. And their letters don't talk about the tunic. So I have not yet found, and they say, oh, I'm so busy, it's really taking a long time to get this Paracas mantle done. And it suggests that that's not then the same person that would have been working on the tunic at the same time. The incoming receipt from the National Gallery only shows that it arrived, but I don't know whether it arrived already in a repaired state or still awaiting conservation and then was going to be sent back out for conservation. It seems to happen both ways with the Bliss collection. And sometimes he organizes their conservation as part of purchasing them. And it happens while it's still with the dealer. I have not yet found who Bliss purchased the tunic from. My hope in publishing the book was that, people might come forward with saying, oh, we have more letters or we have an archive here, you should come look, just to try and put it out there that now we know sort of the window of time more specifically when to look for letters that might say more about the tunic. The challenge with a lot of the letters in this period were that images were expensive. So if you sent a letter as a dealer to Bliss, many of the letters read, I have some things that might interest you. Check the photograph. Let me know if you want it. If you want it, great, but otherwise send me the photograph back. And so you get these letters that you don't actually know what the object is being described because the photograph is no longer associated with the letter. So that's, those are my hope is, for instance, that Bliss might not have been the only person that the dealer approached. And there might be other letters in other archives of other people who were acquiring such textiles or interested in such textiles at the time. And their archives might be what actually reveal more about the garment eventually.
Thank you. So I'm going to kind of summarize. There's a few questions that I think I can maybe tie together and then turn it over to the committee, because I do see we're a little bit past our initial scheduled time, but this is really great information, Andrew. And if you're willing to keep going, I'd love to have you answer these questions. So some of the questions that came up were speaking about the sources of the camelid and cotton fibers that were used for the content. And then there's also comments about the dark blue dyes, and then about how wool and cotton take dyes very differently. So could you kind of speak to those three questions? I think it could be, go for it. Yeah.
So, camelid fibers, camelids were llama, alpaca, vicuña. They are morphologically similar enough as a fiber that what I can show or tell is the grade of the fiber, how thin it was. But it's hard to know if, for instance, it was like a very fine neck fiber from the alpaca, or if it was like a coarser back fiber from a vicuña. But it is a very, very high grade of camelid fiber. There are natural undyed colors of camelid fiber in the cloth. Obviously, the white is undyed. But there are these small areas of brown under the arm openings and in the side seams. The other ones, however, are all dyed. I'm assuming that it's dyed over white fiber, but of course I can't necessarily show that directly. The cotton fiber that was used in the tunic is a light pale, sort of white off-white cotton that's used for the warp. Cotton was grown on the coast. I think something that's really interesting about the tunic is sort of considering how these fibers came together. If, for instance, it was vicuña fiber, vicuñas weren't domesticated. They were actually rounded up in the wild annually. That could be a possibility. The other possibility, obviously, could be that, the best sort of fiber was culled off the top of growers and producers from all across the empire. In which case, that also would be a really interesting additional sort of symbolic way of showing that the tunic represented the whole empire, because you had fiber from all over the regions. Something, scientific study of the fibers could maybe show, more like strontium analysis, for instance, might be able to show whether the fibers were all from the same region, or, for instance, if the animals were genetically related. These different sort of growing regions, you have like warm coastal and tropical climates on either side of the Andes, and then of course it's very cold in the Cusco region itself. So that also explains why there were two blue dyes. Indigo is the much better blue dye, but in the Andes, they never developed the process of sort of creating cakes of indigo or sort of shelf-stable indigo like in Southeast Asia. So everything had to be produced directly from the leaves, the fresh leaves. So that would have probably created like a seasonality to being able to dye with indigo, or the sort of, if you don't have direct trade with an area in the moment, you might not be able to get sort of the indigo dye as readily. So I think what happened is that there's a local source of blue dye that they're using in the highlands. This is actually attested to in the second Marua manuscript, the one that only has the one illustration, where they say that the most common blue dye that was used in the region was from a purple potato. So it makes sense that in the highlands, where potatoes obviously originate, that they were using purple potatoes to create this blue dye. I've tried doing this with purple potatoes from Whole Foods. I can't get I can't get a rich blue dye from it. I end up sort of with like a green color. But working with weavers and dyers actually in the Cusco region, a good friend named Timoteo Carita and his family, we actually did use purple corn, which maybe is a similar sort of chemical makeup, and he created a dark blue dye from it. But he's never actually used it for weaving textiles because it fades. So he still asked me to bring indigo when he can't get it in Cusco from the US and bring him indigo to use for textiles there. Which just goes to show that, these are longstanding issues in the region of getting access to indigo. And even though you might have other things that can be blue dyes, they might not be as light fast. Now, I think there was 3 parts to the question. I think I've answered 2. Was there some part of that I didn't touch on?
You touched on cotton wools, you touched on the dyes, and you touched on camelid and cotton. I think you did. I think you did. And so I would love to turn it over to Dr. McGowan and Dr. Hendon if you have any questions or thoughts that you would like to share before we wrap up today.
I just wanted to mention there's a section in your book when you talk about what these tunics would look like when people were wearing them, or when the South Inca was wearing them. Because as you point out, when they're displayed, they're always flat, right? They're usually hanging. Sometimes they're lying flat. And in these sources of images that we have, they show up as very flat, they look very stiff. And I just thought I would just love it if you could just mention very briefly what you found and how you did that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's thank you for mentioning that and bringing that up, because that's really the portion of the research that was so inspired by Shep's work. I, as an undergraduate at Yale, took costuming courses in the Yale School of Drama with Sharon Hirsch, who is the head of the costume shop. And so she taught me to drape and pattern make, and I was using Shep's patterns. So one of my final projects in one of those courses was recreating something with his pattern, a frock coat. And so that really was the sort of question, was like, thinking about those patterns and how different the patterns looked flat on the book versus how they would look on the human body. I said, I really need to drape this garment in real life and put it over a mannequin and understand how the fabric would have hung. So that was actually one thing that I did in the many years of working on this, was finding fabric that had the similar hand and drape, and understanding on a form how it would drape, how it would hang. And what's interesting is that the neck, obviously the scaffold in the neck doesn't create an opening, it just creates a slit. So there's no space for the neck to really enter through the cloth. So it creates sort of wrinkles on either side of the neck opening because the fabric bunches up. And then when it diverts into a V, that causes a sort of central funnel of fabric to come forward and then hang toward the middle. That's useful in the sense that if you're a slightly more portly person, there's fabric in the front to accommodate. It also means you have a little more sort of give around the front and back when sitting down. But it does also mean, though, that since the sleeves come out here, when you bring your arm down, you cover up a lot of the fabric, and it's sort of like sort of the way that like the bottom of a milk carton folds or a Tetra Pak. And it creates this sort of fold that then also bunches a lot of the designs, makes them somewhat invisible under the arm. And that's just like, it was a really interesting aspect of working on it, was that, we talk about how it's so rigid and gridded, and that we might look at this and see some sort of decipherable text in it. But on the body, you really wouldn't see this. You'd see sort of a lot of truncated and sort of overlapping designs disappearing into wrinkles. And so that was really eye-opening.
I have a question about the choreography of protection and the way in which you talk about scale of the tiny references to these tunics. And I'm thinking out of where I work in Southeast Asia, and sultan's garments like the patola textile from India, or the antakasuma, which would be a checkerboard garment that the sultan would have worn. It's all about protection and sort of the role of scale and the miniature. And so I guess my question is, you call it a biography of an object. And I'm just curious about the unbounded self and the way in which this tunic seems to reference a choreography of protection of a whole community. And you write beautifully about the collaborative element of weaving. So I wondered if you could speak to kind of concepts of self and the unbounded nature of them.
Well, I think that sort of your remarks on protection actually make me think really interesting of like another dimension in which the garment could have been evoking protection through the use of these reduced scaled military tunics, because of course, while it maybe graphically did something within the takapus and the sort of relationship of the military sort of interspersed with the kinds of motifs that people within Inca society and nobility within Inca society would have been wearing, they also sort of ensconced or encased the emperor's body with these protective elements, and very well could have offered another sort of symbolic dimension of protecting the emperor. These individuals in military tunics would have been directly around him, surrounding him, in front of him, and then also encased on his body in a way that's really beautiful. So yeah, I think that's a really great additional reading of how that could have functioned design wise.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Andrew and the Shep Committee, thank you all so much for joining us today. It was a real treat to learn all these, all the research that you put into this amazing tunic. And I think that there was a lot of folks that learned a lot today and lots of questions that will probably still come up. But I encourage everyone to visit TSA's website, and there you can learn a little bit more about Andrew's book and the work that you've done. So thank you again for joining us. And did you want to say anything else? Yes.
To say I also have a personal website, andrewjameshamilton.com. And there's a message section on the website. So if anyone has more questions or is curious about anything, I'm happy to feel free to write me there, and I'll get back to you.
Great.
But thank you again for the recognition of the award, and for the opportunity to share the research further with all of you.
And the emojis that are coming up, hearts and balloons and smiley faces. It's very positive response.
It absolutely is. And we're thrilled, again, to have awarded you the Shep Award for 2025. And on behalf of the Textile Society of America and the R.L. Shep Committee, Award Committee, thank you very much for joining us today. And we hope to see you at our next TSA program.